They called it the most beautiful room in the house. A family in Birmingham painted the walls, hung the paper, breathed it in. Within weeks, the children stopped eating. The father lost his vision. The pet bird died first. No one broke in. No one used a weapon. The poison was already there, pressed into the walls, printed in emerald green, selling for 12 shillings a roll. Victorian England had a system. Factories ran 24 hours printing wallpaper laced with arsenic compounds. Merchants stacked the rolls. Decorators applied them by hand, cutting, pasting, smoothing the poison flat against every surface of every room. Doctors called it nervous exhaustion. They prescribed sea air. The wallpaper stayed on the walls. One room could hold 2.5 kilograms of arsenic, enough to kill thousands, enough to make an entire household waste away slowly, convinced they were simply unlucky with their health. They were not unlucky. They were being poisoned by their own home, and nobody was supposed to find out. To understand how this happened, how an entire civilization decorated its way into slow death, we need to go back to the beginning of the most dangerous era in domestic history. If stories like this one stay with you, where something beautiful hides something far darker, consider subscribing. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? Now, to understand how a poison became a status symbol, we need to understand the world that made it possible. By the mid-19th century, Britain was the wealthiest nation on earth, and it wore that wealth on every wall. The Industrial Revolution had not merely changed how goods were made, it had changed how people imagined themselves. A factory worker in Manchester could now aspire to a sitting room that looked, at least from a distance, like the drawing room of a minor aristocrat. Mass production had collapsed the visible distance between classes, not in income, not in opportunity, but in the surfaces of things, in the texture of life at home. And in Victorian England, the home was everything. It was not simply where you lived, it was a declaration, a moral statement, a carefully constructed display of who you were, what you valued, how far you had come. The Victorians believed, with a religious intensity that modern minds find difficult to grasp, that a well-ordered home produced well-ordered souls, that cleanliness, beauty, and tasteful decoration were not mere vanity, but civic duty. The home was the fortress of civilization itself. Into this world came wallpaper, not the wallpaper of previous centuries, hand-painted, expensive, reserved for royal palaces and the grandest manor houses. This was something new, industrial wallpaper, printed by machine at scale, in thousands of patterns and colors, available in rolls at every draper's shop in every market town across the country. By 1850, Britain was producing over 100 million rolls per year. The walls of England were hungry, and the factories were feeding them. But something was wrong with the feed. The color that drove the market was green. Specifically, a vivid, saturated, almost luminescent emerald green that seemed to glow in gaslit parlors. It was unlike anything available in earlier generations. It had a depth and richness that made a room look wealthy, vibrant, alive. Fashionable magazines praised it. Interior decorators recommended it. Ladies' journals featured it on their covers. It was the color of aspiration, the color of arrival. The pigment behind that green was called Scheele's green. It had been developed in 1775 by a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele, who had synthesized it from a compound of copper and, crucially, arsenic. Later refinements, including a compound called emerald green or Paris green, intensified the color further and embedded even more arsenic into every roll. A single square meter of wallpaper could contain up to 50 milligrams of arsenical compounds. A modest Victorian parlor, papered on all four walls and ceiling, might hold enough arsenic to kill a small village, distributed invisibly across every surface that a family touched, breathed beside, and slept against for years. No one talked about this, not openly, not yet. The man who understood it best, and who spent the better part of his career trying to make others understand it, was William Morris, not as a scientist, not as a physician, as an artist, as the most celebrated decorative designer in Victorian England, the founder of the arts and crafts movement, and, in one of history's more uncomfortable ironies, one of the largest manufacturers of arsenical wallpaper in Britain. Morris had grown up surrounded by color. Born in 1834 into a prosperous middle-class family in Walthamstow, east of London, he had spent his childhood in a large house with extensive grounds, surrounded by the kind of domestic comfort that the Victorians equated with virtue. He was a sensitive, voracious, deeply imaginative child who consumed medieval romances and Arthurian legends with the same intensity he later brought to pattern design. By the time he arrived at Oxford in 1853, he had already decided that the modern world, industrial, mechanical, commercially driven, had destroyed something essential about human experience. The handmade, the organic, the beautiful. He wanted it back. Morris & Co. says the design firm he established in 1861 with a group of fellow artists and aesthetes, including Edward Burne-Jones and Dante Gabriel Rossetti, set out to transform the visual culture of Victorian domesticity. Their wallpapers, textiles, furniture, and stained glass were unlike anything being mass-produced at the time. Where factory goods were symmetrical, mechanical, and hollow, Morris's designs were alive. They drew from nature, from the twist of a willow branch, the arc of a bird's wing, the spread of an acanthus leaf, and reproduced it with a density and attentiveness that made the walls of a room feel inhabited, breathing. They sold extraordinarily well. The wealthy, the educated, and the culturally ambitious decorated their homes in Morris & Co. patterns, hanging them as declarations of refined taste and social conscience. Morris himself believed he was healing something, that beauty, properly made and properly distributed, could restore the dignity the Industrial Revolution had stolen from ordinary life. But the pigments his company used to achieve those extraordinary greens and blues contained arsenic, and Morris knew it. When confronted with this fact in the 1870s, as the scientific debate about arsenical wallpapers became impossible to ignore, Morris's response was not contrition. It was frustration. He dismissed the concern as a scare. He argued that the dangers were overstated. He continued manufacturing with arsenical pigments for years after the medical community had confirmed the link between wallpaper dyes and systemic poisoning. The man who wanted to heal the home was, quietly, making it sick. The symptoms came slowly. That was the problem. That was why it took so long for anyone to recognize what was happening, and why, even after recognition began, the response remained so inadequate. Arsenic poisoning from wallpaper did not kill like a bullet or a fever. It accumulated. It installed itself in the nervous system, in the liver, in the skin, in the soft tissues around the eyes. A family might live in a freshly papered room for months before anyone noticed anything wrong. The first signs were easy to misread. Fatigue, irritability, a persistent cough, children who seemed to catch every passing illness, who failed to thrive despite adequate food and warmth, adults who woke each morning feeling slightly worse than the morning before. The crucial mechanism was not direct contact, it was air. When damp penetrated the wallpaper, and in Victorian Britain with its uninsulated walls, its coal fires that created cycles of heat and cold, its perpetual urban fog, dampness was a constant. A mold called Scopulariopsis brevicalis could grow within the paste beneath the paper. As this mold metabolized the arsenical compounds in the pigment, it released a gas, trimethylarsine, colorless, odorless, invisible in every way that mattered. It drifted through the rooms of Victorian houses without announcement, without visible trace, gathering most densely in the rooms that were least ventilated, which is to say, the bedrooms where children slept, and the parlors where families spent their evenings behind closed windows. The nursery was the most dangerous room in the house. Dr. Thomas Orton, a physician practicing in London in the 1860s, documented a case that became one of the most cited in the emerging medical literature on domestic arsenic. A family of 7 had moved into a newly decorated house in Limehouse. Within 3 months, 2 of the children were dead. The remaining 5 showed symptoms of what their family doctor initially diagnosed as a wasting fever of unknown origin. Orton, who had been following the developing science, ordered the wallpaper stripped from the children's bedroom and sent for chemical analysis. The results confirmed arsenical contamination at levels he described in his notes as extraordinary and alarming. The wallpaper, he noted, was a fashionable pattern, a deep botanical green with gold highlights. It had cost the family more than a week's wages to install. But the problem was not only wallpaper. The problem was the entire philosophy of the Victorian home. Arsenic had made itself at home long before the wallpaper industry discovered its decorative potential. By the 1840s, It was present in artificial flowers used to decorate ballrooms and drawing rooms, worn in women's hair arranged in vases on mantelpieces, held in the hands of dancers at public events. Artificial flower makers in London, mostly young women working in cramped Soho workshops, absorbed arsenic through their skin and lungs as they dipped wire stems into green dye solutions for 10 and 12 hours a day. Their fingertips turned yellow, then cracked. Their gums receded. Several died before reaching 30. Arsenic was in candles, in children's toys, in the green felt of billiard tables, in the dyed cotton of dress fabrics fashionable enough to be described in society pages. It was used to color confectionery. The brilliant green sugar coating on certain popular sweets of the period contained enough arsenic to cause acute poisoning in a child who ate an entire bag. A London confectioner in 1858, attempting to cut costs, accidentally substituted arsenic trioxide for plaster of Paris in a batch of peppermint drops. 20 people died. 200 more were seriously ill. And through all of it, the machinery of Victorian domestic life kept running. Factories printed. Merchants sold. Decorators applied. Families breathed. The invisible system sustained itself through the collective refusal of all its participants to acknowledge what the evidence was beginning to make undeniable. The wallpaper manufacturers commissioned their own studies. The studies found no danger. The fashion press continued to feature arsenical greens. The decorating industry continued to expand. When scientific voices grew louder, the industry's response was a vocabulary that sounds strikingly familiar to modern ears. Uncertainty, complexity, the need for more evidence, the irresponsibility of panic. Something was very wrong, and the people most responsible for it were the ones least willing to say so. Before we get to what finally broke this system, before we reach the moment when the evidence became too heavy to ignore, if this story has made you look differently at the things around you, at the hidden mechanisms behind ordinary life, consider subscribing to this channel and leave a comment below. Do you think what happened next was inevitable? Or could this have ended differently, much sooner? By the 1870s, the scientific case was overwhelming. Dr. William Odling, a chemist at the Royal Institution, conducted a series of public experiments demonstrating the release of arsenical gas from damp wallpaper samples. The results were reproducible. They were reported in The Lancet and in the popular press. They were discussed in Parliament. The Board of Trade received a formal petition calling for regulation of arsenical compounds in decorative goods. The industry responded by creating a voluntary certification scheme. Manufacturers who wished to could submit their products for testing and, if arsenic-free, could label their goods accordingly. The arsenic-free certificate, as it came to be known informally, was more marketing instrument than safety guarantee. It applied only to products submitted for testing, a fraction of what was actually manufactured and sold, and the testing itself was inconsistent, conducted by private laboratories with no standardized methodology and no mechanism for enforcement. Some manufacturers genuinely reformulated. The search for an arsenic-free green pigment that could match the intensity of Shields green had been underway since the 1860s, driven partly by scientific conscience and partly by the recognition that a poisoning scandal, if it became widely enough associated with a specific company's products, could be commercially fatal. By the mid-1880s, viable alternatives had been developed. Synthetic organic dyes derived from coal tar chemistry that could produce a credible green without the arsenical compounds. These were more expensive to manufacture. They were less vivid in gaslight. They did not have quite the same quality of luminous depth that had made Shields green the color of Victorian aspiration, but they did not kill. William Morris, by the late 1870s, was beginning to shift. Not dramatically, not with the public acknowledgement that the situation perhaps warranted, but the evidence had reached a point where even his considerable capacity for dismissal was strained. In a letter written in 1885, he referred to the arsenic question with a phrase that has been much quoted since. As to the arsenic scare, I was one of the manufacturers accused, and I took great pains to prove that the accusation was groundless so far as I could. It was not quite a confession. It was not quite a denial. It was the sound of a man who had built his life around beauty, reluctantly conceding that beauty could have consequences he had not designed for. By 1900, the deliberate use of arsenic in wallpaper manufacture had largely ended in Britain. Not because of legislation. No law was ever passed specifically prohibiting it. Not because of successful litigation. The legal framework for holding manufacturers liable for chronic poisoning caused by their products did not yet exist in any meaningful form. It ended because the market demanded it, because the middle-class families, who were the primary consumers of fashionable wallpaper, had over the course of 20 years of accumulating horror stories developed a revulsion toward the arsenical greens that no advertising campaign could overcome. The color itself became associated with sickness, with hidden danger, with the particular Victorian terror of a death that could not be attributed, explained, or mourned with any satisfying clarity. The emerald walls of England went pale. Today, if you visit one of the great Victorian houses preserved by the National Trust, Whitewick Manor in the West Midlands, for instance, or Standon in East Sussex, you can still see some of the original Morris & Co. wallpapers in their original positions on the original walls. The colors have faded. The botanical patterns that once seemed to breathe with vitality have settled into a softer, quieter version of themselves. The greens have mellowed toward grey-green, toward the color of old sage, of lichen, of something that has been in the earth a long time. The arsenic where it remains is stable now, locked into the dried pigment, sealed beneath generations of surface treatments, no longer capable of being released into the air in any quantity that poses a measurable risk. Conservation specialists who work with these papers wear gloves when handling them, out of professional caution rather than acute danger. The science has been done, the numbers have been measured, the risk has been assessed and categorized and filed. What cannot be filed is the larger question that the arsenical wallpaper leaves behind. It is not a question about chemistry, or about the carelessness of Victorian manufacturers, or even about the failure of Victorian medicine to respond quickly enough to evidence that was, in retrospect, not difficult to read. It is a question about the relationship between a civilization and its own interior life, about what happens when the things a culture uses to signal its aspirations, beauty, wealth, refinement, the appearance of a well-ordered domestic world, carry within them a hidden cost that the culture is unwilling to examine. The Victorians built their homes as monuments to everything they believed about themselves, and the poison was in the walls from the beginning. Somewhere in England, in a room that has not been photographed or catalogued or written about, there is almost certainly a strip of original Victorian wallpaper still adhered to an old plaster wall, still green, still intact, still holding in its dried and faded pigment the particular compound of copper and arsenic that a Swedish chemist mixed in a laboratory in 1775, and that an entire civilization pressed against its walls, breathed beside its children, and called beautiful. It has been there quietly for over 150 years. It is still there now,